Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of Notes on Google Classroom. Today we're going to be finishing up the plant notes. So if you're using your green packet, this is going to start on page 8 of your packet. It looks like this. And this is going to go into a little bit more detail about vascular plants, vascular seeded plants, and how they reproduce. Let me put on my highlighter here so I can highlight some things. Keep in mind, I'm going to be having you skip a couple things when writing down the definitions because we're trying to just stick to things that are really important, and that's going to help you kind of understand the big picture of everything. If you don't have your green packet and you decided to use the Science Learning Journal, that's fine. You want to just jot down definitions, if you want to sketch a picture, anything that's going to help you remember this information. All right, so this is getting into reproduction in flowering plants. Remember, flowering plants are called angiosperms. And the flower is the part of the plant that's responsible for reproduction. That's the only purpose of the flower. So if you pay attention to the plants that you have in your yard or around, you might notice that some plants only flower a certain time of year. Like, for example, right now is a big time for a lot of plants to flower, and then you won't see them flower again for the rest of the year. And that's because the only purpose of the flower is for that plant to reproduce. There's different plants that will flower throughout the year, throughout the warm seasons. But all right, so here I have a picture of the flower. Here's some of the parts that are inside of the flower. So that's what we're going to talk about now. The sepal is just the outer petals that protect the bud when it starts to grow on the plant. So you could probably go outside right now and find sepals on plants that are blooming right now. Once the flower opens up, you can't really tell the difference between a sepal and a petal. So it just kind of looks like outer petals. I'm not going to have you write that down. The purpose of the petals are to attract pollinators. They're usually colorful and they smell pretty. Some of them smell gross, depending on the pollinator that they're trying to attract. But that's all their purpose, is to get those pollinators to come visit the flower so that pollen will stick to that pollinator and hopefully bring it to another flower. All right, the stamen. The stamen is the male part of the flower. And there's two parts of the stamen, the filament and the anther. The anther is the most important part because that contains the pollen. It's on the top. The filament is just the stem that holds the anther up. So it's going to look different depending on the flower, but it's literally just holds the anther up in the air. So not really that important to write down. But the stamen is the male part, the whole thing. The anther is the top, and it's going to have all the pollen on it. The pistil is the female part of the flower. It's in the center of the flower, usually, depending on the flower, and it consists of 3 parts. The stigma, again, I'm not going to have you write it down, is just the top of the pistil. It's sticky because it wants pollen to stick to it. The ovary is very important. That's what contains the ovules. The ovules are basically the eggs of the plant. And if they're fertilized by pollen, the male reproductive cells, these are the female reproductive cells. So these would be like the sperm, and these would be the eggs. And if these are fertilized, that is what will develop into the fruit. The ovary will protect that. And then last but not least is the seed. The seed is usually going to be hard because it's protecting the baby plant that's inside. So it just has a tiny little plant embryo inside, and until the conditions are right, the fruit will protect that seed, and then that seed could possibly grow into a new plant. So the word pollination is the term that's used to describe when pollen enters the pistil, female part of the plant here in the center, gets down to the ovary where the ovules are and fertilizes them. And then they will develop again into the seeds. So that's how plants reproduce. And that's how two different plants, one plant could be miles away from the other plant, and they can reproduce together, sexual reproduction, and you're going to have half the DNA from one plant, half the DNA from the other plant, and they're going to be able to reproduce and make a new plant. And this is very important if you remember from evolution, because it's allowing for genetic diversity. All right, so that's pollination. And a pollinator could be, everybody thinks of bees, but a lot of different animals are pollinators, a lot of different insects are pollinators. Anything that's going to be going into the flower, sometimes they go in to get pollen, sometimes they go in to get nectar, but whenever they go into the flower, they're going to get pollen, which is here on the tips of the male parts. They're going to get pollen on them, and then they're going to travel around or fly and go to another plant and get pollen into that plant. All right, so here's just a little review. Okay, we got the female part in the middle, which is the pistil, and then we have the male parts around the outside, which are called the stamens. So you're always going to see kind of usually a lily type of a flower to demonstrate these parts. But these are all flowers. So if you have any flowers in your yard and you want to go pick one and peel it apart and see if you can find each of the parts, that would be awesome. All right, and there's where the seeds would develop. Okay. All right, so if that plant is pollinated and has seed, there's different ways of dispersing that seed. So this is very important because it moves the seed away from the parent plant to increase its chances of survival. So depending on the shape of the seed, it's going to disperse in different ways. So there's 6 different ways: wind, water, bursting, on animal, in animal, and by animal. The names of these methods are pretty easy to remember because the name kind of matches how the seed is dispersed. So wind, and if you want to just write down the keywords, again, you can pause this if you need to, but you can just write down like the underlined words if you want. You don't have to write down this whole thing because it's pretty easy to remember. Wind, the seed gets caught in the wind and blows away. So a dandelion, we've all gone out in our yards, picked the dandelion and blown the seeds. That's a good example of wind. They're designed to be very lightweight and fluffy so that they'll float away. These are the helicopters that are dropped by the maple trees, and those are also the way they're designed so that they catch the wind to get further away from the parent tree. By water, the seeds are usually buoyant, so they're going to fall into the water, they're going to float and be able to travel very far before they land somewhere and possibly grow into a new plant. Bursting is when the seeds are kind of crammed into some sort of casing, and then when the casing dries out, it will burst open and the seeds will come flying out and will land somewhere. So there's a couple different methods of doing this, but this is a milkweed. I think this is a milkweed. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's a milkweed. And when I was a kid, we used to play with these. We said you can like poke your fingers in them and peel them open, and they're all fluffy inside, and the seeds will get kind of fly out of them. On animal is when the seeds are spiky, and so they stuck to the animal's fur. And this has probably happened to a lot of you if you've ever walked through a grassy area or been walking through the woods and you get those like burrs stuck in your socks. Those are seeds from plants, and that's designed specifically to get stuck on things. There's a story that the guy who invented Velcro was inspired because he was always taking his dog for a walk, and these seeds would get stuck to his dog's fur, and he had such a hard time getting them off. He was like, this is actually a really great idea for an adhesive, and he invented Velcro. But anyways, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, and I actually was on a walk today, and I saw a whole bunch of rounded, spiky kind of seeds on the ground from a tree, which is this type of seed dispersal. So that's on animal, and this is easy to remember because you want to think of it's going to stick on the animal's fur. In animal is when the animal is going to eat the seed, and then usually it's a bird, but it could be any kind of animal. They're going to travel miles, and this is a really great seed dispersal method because the animal is going to travel very, very far before they poop out the seed. And then that seed is going to have a natural fertilizer around it because poop is a good fertilizer, and it can grow into a new plant. And this is why we have so many edible fruits. I talked about in class, if you remember, that a fruit is anything that protects the seed. So it's not always something that we think about in the grocery store that we're going to eat. Sometimes it is like this, sharp pokey thing is technically a fruit. Okay. But the plants that put their seeds in something that they want to be dispersed in an animal are usually the yummy fruits that we eat. So berries, strawberries, apples, all these things are designed that way. Okay. By animal. So this is when an animal will hide the seed, so they bury it, and then they just forget about it, and they basically planted the seed for the plant. And this is easy to remember because you just think of by, it's purposely done by the animal. On animal is when it's stuck to the fur. The animal didn't want it to stick to the fur. By animal is when they purposely hide it. So I always think about from Ice Age, the squirrel, I forget his name, but he's always hiding, he's always losing his little acorn. And anyways, squirrels are famous for doing this because they're always burying things all over the place and then they forget about them. All right, quickly, I wanted to just review asexual reproduction in plants. This is a way that plants can reproduce on their own. So remember, asexual is one parent, genetically identical offspring. So plantlets is when you're going to have little baby plants that grow off the parent plant. So spider plants are a perfect example. I have some succulents that have little plantlets, and I might turn that into a video for you guys, either this week or next week. And basically that baby plant can break off and it can survive fine on its own. Tubers, so potatoes are perfect examples of tubers. Tubers are just like a type of root. They're like bigger and thicker and they store nutrients. And they help the plant survive over the wintertime. And then those tubers themselves can grow into a new potato plant. So remember, a potato is actually just the root of a plant. You're actually eating the root part, but if you let it grow, it's going to grow stems and leaves, just like all the other plants. So that's an example of a tuber. So it can, again, reproduce on its own, and it's part of the root system. Runners are part of the stem system above ground. So a good example of runners is strawberries. So they get kind of these long stems, and they will stretch very far away from the plant, and then that stem can develop its own root system down into the ground and just start a whole new plant. Mint is another one that will do this. I have mint, I grow it in my garden, and it can be a little invasive. It can kind of hurt your other plants because it's able to just kind of reproduce like crazy. Those are 3 different ways that plants can asexually reproduce. All right.